Good morning, everybody. My name is David Gough, and my colleague Janice Tripney. We both work at the EPPI-centre, which is in the Institute of Education in University College in London. On the screen, we've also put the name of Lorenz Langer, because he's a colleague who was involved in the bit of research that we're going to report on today. And it fits well with Camilla's presentation, but it's a kind of different level of analysis, more macro level of analysis. So Camilla was talking about the different aspects of the relationship between evidence production, evidence from research, and the use of that evidence in teaching practice, and what happens in between that process. So what EIPPEE is concerned with, which is research on evidence production and use. So we've undertaken a review, well, in fact, 2 reviews, but it's a very macro level of analysis, and it's across different areas of social policy, and it includes 2 reviews of reviews. So this is because there's a lot of studies in this area, and there's quite a few reviews of those studies, so we've brought together the reviews, so it's a review of reviews. And the first one was the reviews on using evidence to inform decision-making. And so the little emphasis is slightly different from Camilla's, highly related, because Camilla is talking about how to implement research in practice in schools, and that's having agreed what it is that evidence is decided is a good thing to do, and then to implement it. Whereas we're talking a little bit about the step before, where there is consideration of using that evidence. So it's part of that process moving from the evidence use. So it's a little bit beforehand, so that's one difference. And also we're looking at it at a very macro level of analysis. So we did a review of reviews of that EIDM literature, evidence-informed decision-making literature. But we were also very aware that this is a relatively new area of work, research on research use. And we've got over 100 years of social science research, so there may be other issues, other ideas out there in social science that could be relevant to using research, which hasn't yet happened to have been studied by the evidence-informed decision-making literature. So sorry if that's all a bit convoluted. So it's 2 reviews, and of course this is very high level, very macro, and also it's covering a lot of literature, lot of territory. So to try and understand all of this literature, we need to have some nice, great, wonderful theory to explain the relationship between research production and research use. Unfortunately, we don't have a nice, easy theory which works. There are a lot of theories out there, and they tend to include every factor that you could possibly think of, and then lots of arrows between all of these different factors. So it's just a kind of a screen full of arrows. It doesn't really help you as a theory to how you might be able to think through how to structure this relationship between research and using the research. So we're lacking an overall theory, and yet we need some form of structure to try and understand and to deal with this literature that we're looking at. So we're very influenced, particularly by the work of Sandra Nutley from the University of St Andrews, and looking at different mechanisms, and we've got here on the screen M1 to M6, different mechanisms that might be happening between research and it being used. So these are from Sandra Nutley, but we developed them a bit in the first EPPI project that we were funded by the Directorate General for Education and Culture of the European Commission. And the 6 are awareness of research, M2, agreeing what is research evidence, M3, access to that evidence, interaction between researchers and those using the research, skills in understanding and using research, and structures, organizational systems and structures within which those other mechanisms might be able to function. And then also, these things could be, these mechanisms could operate at the individual level, or they could operate at the organizational level, or national or international level. So I think, in Camilla, most things in your talk were predominantly at the individual level, though I think some of the things about school leaders could be thought of as the school level as well as a school leader on the individual level. So it's a way to try and understand that. And then, in addition to the levels and the mechanisms, there's also kind of more fine-grained behavioral issues, which again I think would, Camilla's review is particularly focuses on behavioral mechanisms about the capability, motivation, and opportunity to use that research in your decision-making and use in your practice. So when you're going through your 6 themes, because I hadn't heard your presentation before, I was thinking they relate quite well to some of these behavioral aspects. And this distinction, this behavioral distinction, comes from a review of behavioral change by Susan Mickey, also in University College London. So I'm going to now hand over to Jan, who's going to take you through the macro research results, and then I'll come back at the end. So do you need to take this from me?
Okay, well, I use this. Hello, welcome everyone. So I have the job of condensing. Our technical report was 350 pages, and quite a lot of that would be results. I have 6 slides, so I'm hoping to get 300-odd pages into 6 slides, which will be quite a task. So you're very much getting high-level results. So I'm going to take you through the 6 mechanisms and tell you a little bit about what we found. On the left-hand side are the key messages from our review of reviews that was focused on the EIDM literature, and then on the right-hand side, that's the insights from the social science, the broader social science literature. So what works to increase evidence use? We found that interventions facilitating access to research evidence were effective. We found quite robust evidence on that. However, it was very much conditional. It was only effective if the intervention facilitated not only opportunities to access evidence, but also motivation to access the evidence. And an example of that amongst the interventions that we found would be if you took a simple research database. A research database on its own wasn't enough. It wasn't effective at increasing research use. But if you combine that with the tailoring of personalized messages to a decision maker, and actually using that to motivate them to use the research database, then that kind of intervention was effective. And that was one of many examples that we found of these types of interventions that were underpinned by M3. Then on the right-hand side, we have the insights from the social science literature. And there was lots of different, these are the broad categories. But social science knowledge about tailoring messages, how to target messages, how to improve the design of information systems, user interfaces on a computer. That kind of knowledge, which at the moment isn't directed to EIDM, we think there's lots of insights in there that could actually help build the knowledge of how to support and encourage greater research use. So M5, building decision maker skills in accessing and making sense of evidence. Again, those types of interventions, we found quite robust evidence that they were effective. But again, it was conditional on not only increasing decision makers' capability to access and use research evidence, but also their motivation. So straightforward, simple workshops that might be delivered to different decision makers, perhaps to increase their critical appraisal skills of literature. On their own, that kind of passive intervention, they were not effective. In our review, we didn't find that they were. But if they combined that with different activities to help increase motivation, then there was evidence that those types of intervention were effective. And looking at the social science literature, again, lots of different kind of nuggets of information in there, different types of knowledge that could be useful and feed in. And in particular, perhaps, adult learning, theories and techniques that are kind of key for adult learning. We as people, myself and David, that do a lot of training of decision makers, perhaps we need to look at that broader literature and incorporate some of those techniques and theories into our own teaching so that we're able to improve those EIDM workshops for decision makers. M6, lovely fancier diagram there. So interventions fostering changes in decision-making structures and processes. M6, interventions underpinned by this mechanism were effective, we found, but only if they were formalizing and embedding the other mechanisms of change within the intervention, hence the symbol with M6 round. And in particular, that combination of 2 or 3 of M1, M3, and M5, they were the most common other mechanisms that M6 tended to be wrapped around. So an example of that type of intervention might be, so if you took the research database we were thinking about earlier, so an organization might try to embed access to evidence by having a database on the a home page of a website, so that when different decision makers log in the morning, the first thing they see on their website, on the home page, is the research database. So it's a reminder and encouragement that the search evidence is important for their role. So that's an organization taking a move to embed it within the organization. And again, more insights from the social sciences could be used to improve those mechanisms and interventions. So they were the 3 that we found fairly robust evidence across 6. We had 36 systematic reviews that the left-hand column evidence is based on, so that we found evidence for M3, M5, and M6. We found evidence of no effects on research use for M3 and M5, where they were passive interventions. So M3 and M5 were only effective if they targeted both, the opportunity or capability and motivation. So it was the motivation to use research evidence. The intervention had to think about that and actually to build it in. So often they were multi-component rather than single-component interventions, a little bit more complex than your straightforward database. So there was no evidence that your passive M3 and M5 type interventions were effective. M4, which is interventions that are fostering or facilitating collaboration and interaction between decision makers and researchers. Interventions like this network, this conference, those type of interventions. Again, if they were unstructured, we didn't find any evidence that they were effective and having that long-term goal of increasing evidence use. They might have some intermediary outcomes where there'd be motivation. So as participants, you might leave today feeling more motivated to use research evidence because of meeting in a network. But because this is fairly unstructured, it's not necessarily going to go on, you're not going to go on and definitely use evidence in the future because of this meeting here. But there were some structured interaction and collaboration type interventions that we found in the reviews. So, different sort of communities of practice and different activities that were going on within them, then there was some potential. So we wouldn't call it robust evidence, but there was some evidence that the more structured interaction type activities were effective. And again, insights from the social sciences, including some about how to build stronger networks and create networks that can actually have the outcomes that you want. For M1 and M2, so building awareness and positive attitudes to EIDM, and building agreement on policy-relevant questions and what is fit-for-purpose evidence, we didn't find any evidence on those. So it's not that they were not effective, we just, within the 36 systematic reviews, there was no evidence on those 2 interventions. And again, we did find from the social sciences lots of different pieces of literature and different interventions that were going on in that body of literature that we thought might be useful for M1 and M3. Creating social and professional norms. There was lots of information there that we thought actually that could help support 1 and 2. So just to recap, M3, providing access to research evidence, has to go beyond a passive approach and actually aim not only to increase the opportunity by getting research out there, such as in a database or policy briefs, it also had to try and increase decision makers' motivation to use evidence. And the same with skills. If you're going to build decision makers' skills, capability is important, but also motivation. You need to take them that one step further. And then structures, supporting change in processes and structures is important, and there was some evidence, but it was involving this embedding of the other mechanisms. We didn't find any evidence of M6 working on its own. And I'm going to pass back to David now.
Okay, so as Jan said, you know, the amount of detailed results from this review are very extensive, but we really wanted to emphasize that this way of thinking, of trying to structure using the framework to consider what we're doing when we're trying to enable an evidence use, we think can be very, very helpful. Because it can help us think about what are we doing? Is it sufficient? So anything that we do, which of these levels, which of these mechanisms, and which of these behavioral components are we using to try and increase evidence use, whether it's in teachers in schools, whether it's policymakers or whatever. So in the UK, you know, the most initial approach to just trying to get evidence to be used was to make it available, and then when we found that wasn't sufficient because it was long, complicated reports, we tried to package it and present it in a more user-friendly approach to teachers. But this framework would suggest that alone may be a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. You need extra things as well as making it nice as a pretty gift. I don't think she's here, but presentation in The Hague in the spring about, in the Netherlands approach, trying to get better interactions between government, schools, higher education institutions, and schools. Again, a necessary component, but what extra components might be necessary to get the evidence to be used. And then the M6 that Jan told you about structure. If we, Camilla talked about David Hargreaves and making references between education and health research. In health, around the world, we do have systems and structures. We have infrastructure to help evidence use. So one example is NICE, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in the UK, which determines what services are recommended in the National Health Service. So the traditional way we have is that we ask questions, we do research, and a million flowers bloom, and then sometimes we do some reviews about that research and disseminate it. But the structured process within the NICE is that ministry identifies issues for policy and practice in health and social care, and then they set up a guidance committee made up of different stakeholders, including user groups, including patient groups, and they then request systematic reviews which are focusing on their issues and questions. So you have relevance and motivation. 4, agree on evidence. You have motivation, you have agreement on evidence, and then you have guidance, which is kind of co-produced in a way between the researchers and the stakeholders. So should we have similar structures in education? We're moving in that direction in the UK a bit with the work of the Education Endowment Foundation, which Steve Higgins is going to talk about, and I think I've got other speakers in this conference who started more on this side of the graph, but are now moving towards more of a guidance model. But it's only one example of a type of structure and process that you could have for informing decision making by teachers and schools. But you can also think about processes that you might have in government. Today, a colleague of ours is a witness into UK Lords, the Parliament Committee of the Lords, discussing how evidence should be feeding into legislation. And the process that we have at the moment in the UK ministries is having expert committees. And expert committees of academic advisors is nowhere near as structured as this process that we have for considering health use. It's a much more ad hoc, non-systematic approach. So we'll finish there. We just hope we gave you a flavor of this work. The full report is available online. 100 page? The 150 summary report is available in blue, but trying to learn from our results, our colleague Jonathan Brecken has written a summary which is much more focused on the needs of people who may want to use this research, using evidence, what works. Hopefully will increase, be better packaged, but also increase motivation for using this approach to considering evidence use. So thank you very much.